The way we talk about the future of the planet often feels like a choice between denial and doomism. But what if we looked at the data? Hannah Ritchie, deputy editor at Our World in Data, has dedicated her work to making complex global challenges, like climate change, energy, and sustainability, more understandable and actionable. In this guest lecture, in conversation with Beatrice Erkers, she shares insights from her book, Not the End of the World, exploring what the data actually tells us about humanity's progress, where technology, including AI, can help, and how we can build a future that is not just survivable, but sustainable and hopeful.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for joining us for this guest lecture at the course. Hannah, you're a researcher at Our World in Data, but maybe you could just start with introducing yourself and talk maybe a bit about your work on your book that came out not too long ago, but Not the End of the World.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Hannah Ritchie. I am deputy editor at Our World in Data and a researcher at the University of Oxford. And the work we do at Our World in Data is, I like to frame it as, we sit between research and data providers and the general public, policymakers, journalists, etc., where I almost see us as being kind of translators, trying to translate research and data into key insights in a way that the general public or non-experts can understand and try to make changes in the world, right? So we frame it around tackling the world's largest problems. And what I think is really key there is that people underestimate how much we already know about many of these problems and solutions. And that's because there is this translation understanding gap between researchers and then the people that might take that out into the world and put it into practice. So that's my work at Our Own Data. But my background is actually in environmental science primarily. Like my scope at Our Own Data is now much broader and we cover many more topics. But that's my kind of roots as environmental science, which is where Not the End of the World comes from, where there I focus on 7 of our big environmental problems, including climate change, air pollution, food, biodiversity, etc. And I take this data-driven approach of looking at where we come from, where are we now, and what do we need to do next. I think what's maybe slightly different from most environmental books is that I'm maybe like a bit more optimistic and cheery about our prospects of solving these problems than many other environmental books. So I think that's the type of framing that it's often perceived as in the media and in interviews and stuff, is that I'm the optimistic one in the environmental movement.
Yeah, it's I think a breath of fresh air for many people. And yeah, you've done with that book like some really incredible work on, I think, debunking some myths about sustainability and progress. And in your book there's like things you should worry less about and things you should worry more about. And there was more things to worry less about, I think, than things to worry more about, which is good to keep in mind. But what do you think are like the biggest misconceptions about the future of climate? And yeah, how can we shift the conversation to be more constructive?
Yeah, so I think what's key and why there's a lot of stuff in the book of things to stress less about is that I think our human intuitions on what makes a big difference are often very off from reality. And I think if you ask people what are the biggest things you can do for the environment, they'll often mention the stuff that has a really small impact. So stuff like recycling and switching off their lights and looking at home appliances. And it's fine to do that stuff. I do that stuff as well. But if you're doing that at the expense of the really big stuff, we're going to get absolutely nowhere. And I think that's some of the risk here, is that people are often focusing on the really marginal changes that don't make a big difference, and they're missing some of the big stuff that does. There are other misconceptions that people have, in particular around diet, for example, where I think what people think makes a big difference actually doesn't, and sometimes makes things worse, right? So the very clear example here is that our intuitions for what sustainable or environmentally friendly food is, one, it's natural. So we see natural as being good, synthetic as being bad. Organic we see as being necessarily good, and the environmental credentials are often they're sometimes not better than conventional agriculture at all, or in some cases they're even worse when it comes to land use, for example. And then the other big thing that people get wrong there is that there's a very strong hyper focus on local food and food miles, and people think that local food is naturally better for the environment than stuff that's imported from elsewhere. And then you run the numbers on this, and food miles are a really small part of our carbon footprint of food. And actually what you're eating, and in particular, the amount of meat and dairy that you're eating, by far outweighs any of the other stuff, right? Any of the organic stuff, the local food stuff. So I think we often have our gut instinct or our intuitions on what's green is often off from what reality is. And I think a broader point on broader misconceptions, there is this broad misconception, I think, that on environmental problems, we've made no progress or we're consistently going backwards. And in the book, the climate is one issue, but when I go through the range of different environmental problems we face, there are loads of environmental success stories where at that point in time, it seemed like this was a kind of insurmountable problem, and we have made massive amounts of progress, right? Like we've basically solved the ozone layer problem. And if you go back some decades, that was the environmental problem of its time. Like we've solved acid rain in Europe and North America. Our cities are way cleaner than they were a couple of decades ago. So I think we underestimate some of the progress that's already been made. And I think that's also true for climate, where while it's true that we are not on the trajectory that we want to be on when it comes to climate change, if you were to go back a decade and look at the trajectory we're on there, we're in a much, much better position, right? So we're currently on track for 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. That's too high. That's not acceptable. It's way above our targets. But if you were to look at the trajectory we're on a decade ago, we were on course for 3.5 to 4 degrees, right? So we have improved that trajectory. And I think often we have, I frame it as we often have this kind of end of history illusion where individuals have it as well, right? So if you ask someone, have you changed in the last 10 to 20 years? They'll say, yeah, I've changed a ton. I'm a very different person than I was. If you ask them, will you be different 10 to 20 years from now? They'll say, no, of course not. Like I'm going to be pretty much the same as I am now. So there's this kind of end of history illusion that the past change was possible in the past, but somehow it stops right now. And I think we often get in this mindset around issues like climate, where if we've gone from 3.5 degrees to 2.5 degrees, why would we not be able to bend the curve from 2.5 degrees down to 2 degrees? So I think that's often some of the misconceptions in the framings around this. It's not about this not being a problem or not being an urgent problem, but I think we underestimate some of the progress we've already made and our potential to accelerate that even more.
Yeah, it's like a framing problem and like the ability to hold the tension of the challenges and the like progress at the same time.
Yeah, we at our own data, we actually you can frame it around almost every issue in the world, where we frame it as the ability to hold 3 thoughts in your head at the same time. So one is that the world is still awful, and you can frame this around anything. It's awful, the trajectory we're currently on climate. You can frame it around child mortality. So 5 million children die every year. That's awful. But there's also the framing you need to hold alongside that, which is the world is better than it was in the past. So go back a few decades and 12 million children were dying every year, or go back a few decades and we were on an even worse trajectory on climate. And then the final thought is that the world can be much better, right? We know that we have the capacity to improve these issues even more. And that is the difficulties. The tension of holding all of these 3 thoughts in your head at the same time is very difficult. And it's very common for us to zoom in on one in particular. And I think that's often the way that narratives or headlines or discussions on this are framed. It's focusing on one or the other. And I think you don't get an accurate picture by only focusing on one of the 3.
Yeah, maybe we zoom in on one of them, which was I try to stay up to I program direct existential program. I feel like I try to stay very up to date with the progress that we're making. But I was surprised at how well things are trajecting. I was not aware of in general that we had made progress compared to 10 years ago in climate so much. But I was surprised that one of the ones that was also maybe one that we should be worrying more about, which was the biodiversity one. Do you want to just expand on that one a little bit? And also, what should we be doing there now if we have any sort of agency?
Yeah, biodiversity is hard, and this was the hardest chapter in the book to write. Also because the data on it is the poorest, right? Like, how do you quantify the word biodiversity, right? Like, you go around counting all the bugs and all, and especially over time, like, even if we're getting much, much better at tracking animal populations and nature populations today, we often don't have the longer run historical perspective that we can compare, are things better now than they were in 1980, right? Because we just didn't have the data in 1980. So one is a measurement problem. But I think even when you take all of that into account, it's very clear that we are losing biodiversity at a pretty rapid and alarming rate. And I think the core issue when it comes to biodiversity, with many of the other different problems like climate or deforestation or overfishing, or there's often, it's not that there's a single or sole cause, but there's often only a few things that you actually need to directly target in order to solve that problem. I think the issue with biodiversity is it's almost a compound of all of the other problems that we're facing, right? So climate is often framed as death by 1,000 cuts. So you've got climate risk compounding with deforestation, compounding with industrial agriculture, compounding with livestock, compounding with disease outbreaks. So there's lots of stuff that's compounding on biodiversity, which means one of the key ways to solve biodiversity is to solve all of the other problems, and then biodiversity gets better. That's not a particularly satisfying answer, and it seems quite overwhelming. There are more direct interventions that you can say would have a higher marginal impact on biodiversity loss. There are ways, particularly in richer countries, like we have had success stories in not just stopping the loss of biodiversity, but in restoring biodiversity. So like we've had lots of successful reintroduction of native species. We've had lots of success stories in terms of protecting endangered populations and bringing population levels back up. So there are specific targeted approaches you can take to help that problem. But overall, we won't be able to halt the loss of biodiversity until we tackle climate and agriculture and deforestation and air pollution and all of these other problems.
Yeah, one of the sort of best tools that we have at hand right now would be technology. Are there any technologies that you're excited about that you see we're already maybe implementing, but people may not be aware of them, or that you see, if you're aware of any that you think will be implemented soon or being invented now?
Yeah, I think technology will play a really crucial role in all of these problems. I think two key areas, one is on clean energy and one is on food. So in clean energy, again, I think what's made me most optimistic over the last decade is the technological advances we have in clean energy. The issue when I was looking at this problem 10 years ago, say, is that the alternatives to fossil fuels, i.e. renewable power or other clean energy technologies, were much more expensive than fossil fuels. So it was very hard for me to see how on earth the world was going to, you could frame it as sacrifice short-term economic costs because the alternatives were more expensive than fossil fuels for this long-term gain, right? And you can argue that we should be making that trade-off, but that's not how human psychology works and economic systems work. So there was this inherent trade-off between short-term costs and long-term benefits in terms of environmental protection. What we've seen over the last decade is the plummeting costs of these technologies, right? Solar has fallen by 90%, batteries by 90%, wind by 70%. So there are lots of examples where these technologies have fallen dramatically in price and are now competitive with fossil fuels on price or undercutting them. And what that really means is that we are starting to align our short-term wants or desires with our long-term ones in terms of climate protection, which actually makes me much more optimistic that even if countries or individuals are not doing this for climate reasons, they'll still do it for economic reasons or other co-benefits that come from it. And I think we often don't put as much emphasis on some of the other co-benefits that we get alongside climate action, and I actually think that would help to accelerate that. It's not just about cost there. Also, I think an increasing issue in recent years has been energy security, in particular with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the really sky-high gas prices. I think that has brought energy security even higher on the agenda. So I think there are lots of reasons to be optimistic about technology when it comes to clean energy and climate. And then I think the other technological advances that I am quite optimistic about is in terms of food, right? In particular, meat and protein production has a really high environmental cost and a really high cost for animal welfare. And to get people to switch away from meat at a really broad and large scale, my framework for this is that we need to provide really close, affordable alternatives to meat that basically mimic meat, right? Like I would love it if we all just went to legumes and peas and beans and a plant-based diet, but I think that realistically most people won't make that switch until we have very good alternatives. And I think that sector is getting increasingly good, and I think we are starting to see emerging technologies there. And the final one on food is that I think we could very realistically produce most of the world's protein, not outdoors, but in a lab or in an industrial factory. And then the other one is fats and oils. We know that producing vegetable oils, whether that's soybean or palm oil or the other oils that are often in the headlines, we know that comes with an environmental impact. But there are now startups that are basically just producing that in a lab. And they can basically, they're not even producing a like-for-like substitute. They're able to produce the exact chemical composition of the oils that you would find in these crops. So I think there are lots of innovations in the food sector, which has massive spillover impacts for these environmental impacts, right? So we underestimate the impact that food has on the environment. Like it's a big driver of climate change. It's the leading driver of land use, biodiversity loss, deforestation, fresh water access and availability. Is the leading driver of all of those problems except climate change. So it has really massive spillover impacts.
Thank you. Yeah. And another technology that this course very much focuses on, like a future with AI and how we can use AI to just improve our position. And it's not necessarily like AGI or anything like that. It's more like tool AI, like how can we use AI as a tool to better improve our decision making and just like information landscape. So from like a climate or a sustainability perspective, do you think that AI has a role to play in addressing these challenges?
Yeah, I think so. I think the potential and risks on this are often counteracting in my brain. There are some risks for the potential increase in energy demand, and that obviously has it puts pressure on our ability to tackle climate change. I think some of the narrative around that is potentially prematurely overblown, right? We don't quite know how much energy AI is going to need. And we have been in this position in the past where a couple of decades ago, we were really concerned about the rise of the internet and the rise for energy demand for data centers. So you would find headlines that data centers will increase US electricity by 50%. And that just didn't come true. Even though demand for data centers rapidly increased, it was massively offset by improvements in efficiency. So actually the increase in energy demand was actually quite marginal compared to what people were predicting. I don't know if that will be the same for AI. I don't think anyone quite knows, but I think that's one thing to keep in mind. And then there's the other side of it, which is the benefits that AI could bring in terms of helping us to address these challenges. I think there are a couple of key areas where I think it could have a substantial impact. There are some on the deployment of solutions. And then I think there are also advances that will help us to deal with the impacts of climate change. So one really interesting area is the use of AI in weather forecasting. AI models are getting very close to producing just as high quality. And what's key is a much, much faster pace weather forecasting than previous models. And this is really key for improving early warning systems or disaster resilience. It's also important in terms of food production, right? So being able to provide farmers with really detailed reports and predictions on what weather patterns will be like was really key for helping them to know when to plant the crop, when to put fertilizer on, etc. And this is potentially even more important for lower income countries, where weather forecasting systems in those countries is just not like it is in the UK, for example, where I am. And there's potential is that with AI, we can do it much faster and at higher resolution, but also a much lower cost, right? The key issue in lower income countries is the affordability of these services. So I think that's one area where AI could have a big impact. Another area is in terms of sourcing and finding mineral deposits, right? So to build clean energy, we will need a range of different minerals for solar panels and batteries and wind turbines, etc. And actually, we're already seeing startups in this space have success in using AI to be able to predict where you might find deposits that we didn't know we had before, or being able to give us higher resolution information on the quality of those deposits, the depths of those deposits. So I think that could play a big role in allowing us to identify what are the best deposits to mine and extract, and where are they. And then I think one other very obvious area is that as we transition to clean energy, we have got a much bigger challenge in terms of balancing supply and demand. And that's because we are adding solar and wind and batteries, which have variable demand throughout the day and across weeks and even months. And we obviously want to have a very stable grid. It needs to match the demand that we have, or people demand at any given time. And I think there's a lot of potential for AI to, one, help us identify what's the best place to put a wind farm, what's the best place to put a solar panel, so we can optimize that to get the best return, but also what kind of mix of these sources do you need in order to make sure that you're balancing that grid out at all times. So I think there are a range of applications, both on the implementation of solutions, but also on making us more resilient to climate change, where AI could play a really key role.
That sounds quite exciting and very good use cases. And where do you think, I think you touched on a little bit before, but where do you think that maybe technological innovation isn't enough? We also need more like fundamental changes in terms of just governance and incentives.
So I think for nearly all of these challenges, technology will play a key role in solving them. But I'm not kind of tech optimist in the sense that I think that technology is just going to save us on its own, right? I think nearly always it needs some combination of, yes, the technology, but also the economic and political structures around it that galvanizes support for it. So there are some technologies where I think they're now in the place where they are so cheap, so obvious, that they will be deployed anyway, right? I think solar power is a very good example of this. You cannot stop solar power now, right? It just makes too much sense in order to do that. But what's really key is that when the solar industry was starting out, it wasn't in that position, and it did need strong government support initially, right? Many of these technologies, they eventually reach a stage where they run away on their own, and you can relax the amount of support. But often they were supported to a high degree initially. When it comes to solar power, very early on, Germany provided really key subsidies because they were expensive at the beginning. China has been really key in subsidizing these industries early on. And in some case, we're all now benefiting from these very early governmental and economic interventions. I think there are a range of cases where you need the initial governmental or economic push before you can get to the stage where the technology can stand on its own.
Yeah, that's great. A great perspective, I think. So yeah, another like key focus of this course is just, we refer to it as existential hope, just like having a hope and hopefully maybe even to some extent a vision of what a better future could look like and that it's possible. Do you think that, what's your take on that concept, like existential hope? And do you think it could be good to foster more of it in like the climate discourse, for example?
Yeah, I think so. When I initially heard existential hope, I think I misinterpreted what the actual definition of it was. When I looked up the definition, I totally agreed. I think initially my reaction to existential hope was around, I think the focus wasn't existential. So in my head, I was thinking hope that we're not going to go extinct or that we can prevent extinction. And I don't think I like that framing. I think because, one, I don't think that's really a motivation for a lot of people, right? And two, I think we can do much better than that, right? I think we need to set higher standards than just not going extinct. But when I looked up the definition, I fully agreed, right? Like I think too much of our discussion around climate change and environmental problems is more of this framing of like damage limitation or let's prevent extinction, which I definitely think we should do, but I think we should aim for more than that, right? I think looking to 2050, for example, I don't think our aim should just be to limit the damage as much as we possibly can. I actually think we should be more ambitious and be determined to create an even better future than we have today. And I think that's much more in line with the definition that I saw that you use for existential hope. So I totally agree with that. I think I do use the framing of optimism or hope quite a lot, but it's a very specific in its definition, in the sense that I'm talking about active hope or active optimism. I think when many people hear optimism or hope, they think of this kind of passive variety where it's let's just sit back and let's hope that things will turn out well. And to be clear, that's not my message. If we just sit back, things won't turn out well. But it's this kind of active hope or optimism that there is the potential for us to make the world a much, much better place, and we should be very determined to do that. And I think that's quite in line with the existential hope definition that you use.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. I think that's a perfect also maybe note for us to end on, because that is very aligned with what we are trying to do and get the message out there. And I think what is exciting is that it feels like to some extent it's catching on, or I can see more of a very early stage, but to some extent a little field growing in this.
Yeah.
That's really nice. But yeah, thank you so much, Hannah, for taking the time. And yeah, this was really useful. Thank you.